The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning like a knife to the artificial letterhead. Legal threats, demands to tear down what had taken months to build. Karen Martinez stood in her pristine driveway, manicured nails clutching the HOA violation. Notice her voice sharp enough to cut glass as she declared war on the neighbor who dared defy her authority. But buried in the dusty files of last year's approved permits lay a truth that would turn her world upside down, and when that truth finally surfaced, the hunter would become the hunted in the most spectacular way imaginable. The sound of construction had been driving Karen Martinez insane for 3 weeks straight. Every morning at precisely 7:30. The rhythmic pounding of hammers and the whir of power tools shattered the peaceful silence of Willowbrook Estates. And every morning Karen felt her blood pressure spike another notch higher. She stood at her kitchen window now, designer coffee mug trembling in her perfectly manicured hands. Watching the chaos unfold next door, the Hendersons' backyard was a battlefield of lumber, concrete mix, and what appeared to be the skeletal frame of some monstrous outdoor structure. Dust particles danced in the morning sunlight, settling on her newly washed Mercedes in the driveway like a personal insult. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she muttered, her reflection scowling back at her from the window. At 42, Karen had cultivated an image of suburban perfection blonde highlights, touched up religiously every 6 weeks. Yoga pants that cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills, and a smile that could freeze hell over when deployed strategically. As president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, she had built her reputation on maintaining standards, protecting property values, and ensuring that every blade of grass in their exclusive community knew its place. The Hendersons were disrupting that order, and Karen Martinez didn't tolerate disruption. She grabbed her phone and speed-dialed Patricia Wells, her most reliable ally on the HOA board. Patricia answered on the second ring, breathless as always. "Karen, thank God you called. I've been walking past their house every morning with Mr. Whiskers. And the noise is just, I know exactly what it is," Karen interrupted, her voice crisp with authority. "It's a violation. A blatant, inexcusable violation of our community standards. Have you seen the size of that thing they're building? It looks like some kind of pavilion or gazebo. Be listening. With a full outdoor kitchen setup, the concrete pad alone must be 15 by 20 feet. Karen's jaw tightened. She'd seen it too, of course. The structure would be massive when completed, a permanent outdoor entertainment area, with built-in grills, countertops, and what appeared to be rough plumbing for a wet bar. It was exactly the kind of ostentatious display that attracted the wrong kind of attention to their carefully curated neighborhood. Did they submit architectural plans? Karen asked, though she already knew the answer. As HOA president, every significant modification request crossed her desk. Did they request approval for major landscaping changes? Not that I've seen, Patricia confirmed. I checked the files yesterday. Nothing from the Hendersons since they moved in 2 years ago. Perfect. Karen smiled, the expression sharp enough to cut crystal. Then we have them. She hung up and immediately dialed the HOA's legal advisor, Marcus Chen, a precise man who specialized in property law and had helped Karen navigate several previous disputes. Marcus answered with his usual professional efficiency. "Good morning. Karen, what can I do for you?" "I need a cease and desist letter prepared immediately," she said, already walking toward her home office. "The Hendersons at 847 Maple Ridge, Diver Drive, are constructing an unauthorized permanent structure without proper HOA approval. I want it stopped today." Marcus paused. "Have you confirmed they don't have approval? Sometimes paperwork gets missed, and we want to be absolutely certain before we." Marcus Karen's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I am the HOA president. I personally review every architectural request. The Hendersons never submitted anything. They're in clear violation of Section 4.3 of our community guidelines regarding permanent structures and landscaping modifications." "Understood. I'll have a letter drafted within the hour. Do you want me to cite specific code violations?" "All of them," Karen said, settling into her leather desk chair. "Unauthorized construction, failure to obtain proper permits, violation of setback requirements, and disruption of community standards. I want this airtight." Marcus sighed. "I want them to understand exactly how much trouble they're in." An hour and 20 minutes later, Karen stood on the Hendersons' front porch, the legal letter crisp in her hands. The construction noise had temporarily stopped, and she could hear voices from the backyard, David Henderson's deep laugh mixing with his wife Sarah's lighter tone. They sounded happy, carefree, completely oblivious to the storm about to hit them. Karen rang the doorbell with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything else in her life. David Henderson answered the door, wearing work clothes and a smile that faded the moment he saw her expression. He was in his mid-30s, with the kind of easy confidence that came from success in the tech industry and a face that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with enough time and effort. "Karen," he said, wiping his hands on a towel. "Good morning. What can I do for you, Mr. Henderson?" Karen's voice carried the formal tone she reserved for official HOA business. "I'm here in my capacity as president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association regarding the unauthorized construction currently taking place on your property." David's smile faltered completely. "I'm sorry, what?" "The permanent structure you're building in your backyard." Karen held up the letter. "You've failed to obtain proper architectural approval as required by our community guidelines. This is a formal cease and desist order." She watched the confusion spread across his face with deep satisfaction. Behind him, she could see Sarah Henderson approaching from the kitchen, concern etched in her features. Sarah was younger than her husband, probably early 30s, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't require the extensive maintenance Karen's appearance demanded. She was also, Karen had noticed, the type of neighbor who baked cookies for new residents and organized informal block parties, the kind of person who mistook friendliness for leadership. "There must be some mistake," David said, taking the letter, but not opening it. "We have all our permits. We went through the proper channels." Karen's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Mr. Henderson, I personally review every architectural request submitted to this HOA. You never filed anything." "That's impossible," Sarah said, stepping beside her husband. "We submitted our plans months ago. We have the approval letter." "No," Karen said, her voice rising slightly. "You don't, because I would have seen it, because I would have reviewed it, because it would have come across my desk." The couple exchanged glances, and Karen saw something she didn't like, the look of people who knew they were right, but couldn't immediately prove it. It was the look of people who kept careful records, who followed rules, who probably had filing systems that would make her assistant jealous. "Give us one moment," David said, his voice carefully controlled. "Let me get our paperwork." "Your paperwork won't change the facts," Karen called after him as he disappeared into the house. She turned to Sarah, who was still standing in the doorway. "Mrs. Henderson, I understand you're new to the community, but we have standards here. We have procedures. These rules exist to protect everyone's property values." Sarah's response was quieter than Karen expected. "We've followed the procedures. We've lived here for 2 years. We know how the process works." David returned with a manila folder, his fingers moving with quick efficiency through the documents inside. Karen watched with growing irritation as he pulled out what appeared to be official forms, plans, and correspondence. "Here," he said, extending a letter toward her, dated last March, "full approval for our outdoor entertainment pavilion project." Karen took the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar HOA letterhead. The approval was comprehensive, signed, dated, and bearing the official seal. But that was impossible. She had never seen this project. She had never approved this construction. This must be a forgery," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she could see the quality of the printing, the authentic watermark, the correct filing numbers. "It's not a forgery," David said, his voice gaining strength. "It's a legitimate approval from your own organization. We have the returned check for the filing fee, the architectural review comments, everything." Karen's hands were shaking now, though she fought to keep her voice steady. "I need to review this with the board. Construction stops immediately until we can verify the authenticity of these documents." "No," Sarah said, stepping forward. "Construction continues. We have valid permits. We've followed every rule, and we're well within our rights. Mrs. Henderson, I am the president of this HOA, and I am ordering you to, you're ordering us, to violate our legal permits based on your failure to keep proper records," David interrupted, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "That's not how this works." Karen felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, but she had spent 2 decades in Corp. Part 2. The investigation Karen Martinez had always believed that information was power, and over the next 3 days, she dedicated herself to gathering every piece of information about David and Sarah Henderson that public records and careful observation could provide. She approached the task with the methodical precision of a military strategist, because that's exactly what she was, a general preparing for a campaign that would restore her authority and remind everyone in Willowbrook Estates why she had been HOA president for 6 consecutive years. The first thing she discovered was that the Hendersons were more successful than she'd initially realized. David worked as a senior software architect for a major tech company, pulling in what property records suggested was a substantial salary. Sarah ran a boutique marketing consultancy from their home office, with clients that included several local businesses Karen recognized, and that knowledge sent a fresh wave of irritation through her perfectly controlled exterior. People like the Hendersons were dangerous to community harmony, had enough money to be independent, enough success to be confident, and enough education to think they could challenge established authority. They were exactly the type who believed rules were negotiable, that individual desires mattered more than collective standards. Karen sat in her home office, surrounded by printouts of property records, business registrations, and social media profiles, constructing a comprehensive dossier. The Hendersons posted frequently about their renovation projects, their weekend entertaining, their obvious pleasure in their home and neighborhood. In photo after photo, she saw evidence of the kind of casual affluence that grated against her. More disciplined approach to wealth management. But more importantly, she was building a timeline of their activities, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, and opportunities. Her phone rang, interrupting her research. The caller ID showed Marcus Chen, the HOA's legal advisor. "Karen, I've been reviewing the Henderson situation," Marcus said, without preamble. "Based on the documentation you forwarded, they appear to have full approval for their construction project." "I understand that," Karen replied, her voice carefully neutral. "But I want you to look deeper. Full building permit compliance, setback measurements, noise ordinance violations, any possible angle." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Karen, they followed the proper procedures. They have valid permits. Pursuing this further could expose the HOA to liability for harassment." "I'm not harassing anyone," Karen said, her tone sharpening. "I'm ensuring compliance with all applicable regulations. That's my job as president." "Your job is also to protect the HOA from legal exposure," Marcus replied. "And right now, the Hendersons would have a strong case if they decided to push back against what could be perceived as targeted harassment." Karen set down her pen with deliberate precision. "Marcus, are you telling me how to do my job? The Henderson project appears to be completely legitimate. I strongly recommend you let this go." After ending the call, Karen stared out her window at the construction site next door. The outdoor pavilion was taking shape, rapidly. Work with clean lines and quality materials. In a few more days, it would be finished. A permanent reminder of her failure to maintain control over her own community. But Marcus was wrong about one thing. Karen had no intention of letting this go. That afternoon, she drove to the city planning office, a sprawling bureaucratic complex downtown where permits were filed and regulations enforced. Karen had cultivated relationships here over the years, understanding that local government officials could be valuable allies for an HOA president who knew how to work the system. She found Jennifer Walsh in the building permits department, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who had processed countless applications over the years. Jennifer looked up from her computer with the weary expression of someone who had seen every possible permutation of construction drama. "Double quotes, Mrs. Martinez," Jennifer said. "What can I do for you today?" "I need to verify some permit information for a property in Willowbrook Estates," Karen said, sliding a piece of paper across the counter. 847 Maple Ridge Drive. The Hendersons. Jennifer typed the address into her system, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Outdoor Entertainment Pavilion, approved last March. All permits are current and properly filed." "Are you certain all inspections have been completed properly?" Karen asked. "Sometimes contractors cut corners, skip required steps." Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, recognizing the tone of someone fishing for problems. "Mrs. Martinez, the permits are in order. All required inspections have been passed. Is there a specific issue you're concerned about? Karen leaned forward, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial tone that had served her well in previous encounters. Between you and me, Jennifer, there have been some concerns in the neighborhood about the scope of this project. The structure seems quite large for what was originally approved. I can print you a copy of the approved plans if you'd like, Jennifer offered. But I can tell you right now that the construction matches the submitted drawings exactly. 15 minutes later, Karen sat in her car in the parking lot, studying the official blueprints. Every measurement, every specification, every detail matched what she could see taking shape in the Hendersons' backyard. The project was not only properly approved, it was being executed with meticulous attention to the approved plans. But Karen Martinez had not become HOA president by accepting defeat easily. That evening, she attended the monthly Willowbrook Estates community meeting held in the clubhouse of their exclusive neighborhood. About 30 residents were present, the usual collection of retirees, young families, and professionals who cared enough about property values to sacrifice their Thursday evening for HOA business. Karen took her position at the front of the room. With the practiced confidence of someone who had run hundreds of these meetings, she was dressed in her meeting uniform navy blazer, white blouse, minimal jewelry that suggested competence without ostentation. "Good evening, everyone," she began, scanning the familiar faces. "Before we begin tonight's agenda, I want to address some recent construction activity that has generated questions from several residents." She paused, noting who was paying attention. Patricia Wells sat in the front row, as always. The Kowalskis from Oak Street looked interested. Mrs. Chen from the corner house was taking notes. "As you know, we have community standards that exist to protect all of our property values," Karen continued. "When those standards are challenged or interpreted loosely, it affects everyone." She was being careful with her language, staying within the bounds of what Marcus would consider legally acceptable, while still making her point clear. Recent construction at 847 Maple Ridge Drive has raised questions about noise levels, construction hours, and the impact on neighboring properties. She said, "I want to assure everyone that the HOA board is monitoring the situation closely." Harold Kowalski raised his hand. "Are you talking about the Hendersons' patio project? It looks like quality work to me." Karen felt a flash of irritation. Harold was in his 70s. A retired contractor who had opinions about everything construction-related and wasn't shy about sharing them. "The issue isn't the quality of the work, Harold," she replied. "It's about ensuring that all community standards are being followed properly." "Do they have the right permits?" asked Mrs. Chen. "All construction in Willowbrook Estates must comply with both city regulations and our community guidelines," Karen said, carefully avoiding a direct answer. "The board is reviewing all aspects of compliance." The meeting continued with routine business landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, and the ongoing saga of streetlight repairs. But Karen could sense the undercurrent of curiosity about the Henderson situation. Word would spread, as it always did, in their small community. Questions would be asked. Attention would be focused. That was exactly what she wanted. After the meeting, Patricia approached her with obvious concern. "Karen, what exactly are we reviewing about the Henderson project? You said yourself they have proper approval." "There are always multiple layers of compliance, Patricia," Karen replied, gathering her papers. "HOA approval is just one piece of the puzzle. But what other pieces are you talking about?" Karen paused, studying her longtime ally. Patricia was loyal, but not particularly imaginative. She followed rules but didn't understand the spaces between rules, the gray areas where real authority was exercised. "Let me worry about the details," Karen said finally. "Just keep your eyes open. Document any issues you observe, noise complaints, traffic problems, anything that might affect neighborhood quality of life." Over the weekend, Karen implemented a surveillance routine that felt perfectly natural for someone who took community standards seriously. She began taking daily walks through the neighborhood, timing them to coincide with construction activity at the Henderson house. She carried a small notebook documenting start times, noise levels, and the number of contractor vehicles parked on the street. The construction crew was professional and courteous, she had to admit. They arrived promptly at 8 a.m. Well within allowed hours, they cleaned up their work areas daily and kept noise to reasonable levels. The project David Henderson had always been the type of person who solved problems methodically. In his 15-year career as a software architect, he'd learned that the most elegant solutions often came from understanding systems better than the people who built them. Now, sitting in his home office at 2 a.m., surrounded by printouts of HOA bylaws, state regulations, and legal precedents, he was applying that same analytical approach to the Karen Martinez problem. What he'd discovered in 3 days of research was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was run like Karen's personal fiefdom, with procedures that bent or ignored state regulations in favor of concentrated executive power. Financial decisions were made without proper board oversight. Architectural approvals went through a process that gave the president unilateral authority over subjective community standards. Most importantly, the HOA's own bylaws required transparency and accountability measures that hadn't been implemented. In years, Karen Martinez wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was running an organization that was skating dangerously close to violating multiple state laws, governing homeowners associations. David leaned back in his chair, studying the timeline he'd constructed. Karen had been HOA president for 6 consecutive years, a tenure that should have been impossible under the association's own governing documents, which clearly stated that no officer could serve more than 2 consecutive terms without a special election and supermajority vote. There was no record of any such election. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer, Michael Torres, who handled real estate transactions for David's company. Michael was younger than David, aggressive, and had built his practice on helping tech professionals navigate complex legal situations. "This is interesting," Michael said, after David explained the situation. "HOA law is pretty specific about governance requirements. If she's been operating outside the association's own bylaws, that's a serious problem." "How serious?" David asked. "Serious enough that every decision she's made during her unauthorized tenure could be challenged. Serious enough that individual board members could face personal liability for financial decisions made without proper authority. Serious enough that the state could intervene and require a complete reorganization of the association." David felt something cold and predatory settle in his chest. "What would I need to prove that?" "Documentation, meeting minutes, financial records, election records, correspondence, the kind of stuff that HOAs are required to maintain and make available to homeowners upon request." "And if they refuse to provide those records?" Michael's laugh was sharp. "Then you have them on a state law violation that carries automatic penalties." "David, if what you're telling me is accurate, this woman has been running an illegal organization for years. The question isn't whether you can stop her harassment, it's whether you want to destroy her completely." After hanging up, David sat quietly in his office, listening to the sounds of his sleeping house. Sarah had gone to bed hours ago, frustrated by the ongoing conflict with Karen, but trusting him to handle it professionally. Their construction project was nearly complete, and under normal circumstances, this would be a time for celebration. But Karen Martinez had made it clear that normal circumstances no longer applied. David opened his laptop and began typing a formal records request, citing the specific state statutes that governed HOA transparency requirements. He was requesting 6 years of meeting minutes, financial records, election documentation, and correspondence files. Everything that would be needed to document the pattern of illegal governance that he suspected. The next morning, he hand-delivered the request to Karen's house, along with a copy sent via certified mail, to establish a legal timeline. Karen answered the door in her morning workout attire, her expression shifting from polite confusion to barely concealed rage as she read the document. "This is completely unnecessary," she said. "If you have questions about HOA operations, we can discuss them at the next board meeting." "The law requires you to provide these records within 10 business days," David replied calmly. "It's not optional, and it's not subject to board approval." Karen's knuckles whitened as she gripped the papers. "Mr. Henderson, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I'm not playing any games," David interrupted. "I'm exercising my rights as a homeowner to review the records of the organization that governs my property. The same organization that you've been using to harass my family." "I have never harassed anyone," Karen snapped. "I enforce community standards. I protect property values. I maintain the quality of life that makes Willowbrook Estates desirable." By calling code enforcement over 6 hours of flagstone storage, David's voice remained level, professional. By threatening legal action over permits that you yourself approved. By using your position to target residents who embarrass you. Karen stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This community has standards, Mr. Henderson. Standards that existed long before you arrived and will exist long after you leave. Those standards are defined by law, not by your personal preferences, David replied. And the law requires you to provide the records I've requested 10 business days. That afternoon, Karen called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. The board consisted of herself as president, Patricia Wells as secretary, Harold Kowalski as treasurer, and 2 at-large members who rarely attended meetings and generally rubber-stamped whatever. Karen proposed that they gathered in Karen's living room, the same space where she'd held unofficial board meetings for years. Patricia looked nervous, Harold seemed confused, and the 2 at-large members, Jim Brady and Linda Chunna, appeared to be wondering why they'd been dragged away from their regular activities. We have a problem, Karen announced without preamble. David Henderson is attempting to undermine the authority of this board through frivolous records requests and legal intimidation. Harold shifted in his chair. What kind of records is he asking for? Karen waved the request dismissively. Everything. Meeting minutes, financial records, correspondence. He's on a fishing expedition looking for anything he can use to cause trouble. Don't we have to provide those records? Linda asked. I thought homeowners had a right to review HOA documents. Within reason, Karen replied quickly, but this is clearly harassment disguised as a legitimate request. We need to consider our options. Patricia looked uncomfortable. Karen, maybe we should just give him what he's asking for. We don't have anything to hide. Karen's gaze snapped to her longtime ally. Patricia, the issue isn't whether we have anything to hide. The issue is that giving in to these tactics encourages more of the same behavior. If we let Henderson intimidate us into providing unnecessary documentation, every homeowner in the community will think they can make similar demands. But if the law requires us to provide the records, double quotes Jim Brady started, the law requires us to provide reasonable access to legitimate documents, Karen interrupted. It doesn't require us to do free research for residents who want to cause trouble. Harold was studying the records request more carefully. Karen, this seems pretty standard to me. When I was running my contracting business, I had to provide similar documentation to clients all the time. It's just basic transparency. Karen felt control of the meeting slipping away. These people didn't understand the bigger picture, didn't see how Henderson's request was part of a coordinated attack. On the community's stability, fine, she said finally, we'll provide the records. But I want it noted that this board considers Henderson's actions to be harassment, and we reserve the right to take appropriate action if this behavior continues. Over the next week, Karen worked with the HOA's bookkeeper and filing systems to compile the requested documentation. What she found made her stomach turn with cold dread. The records were a mess. Meeting minutes from 3 years ago were missing entirely. Financial records showed irregular approval processes for major expenditures. Election documentation was incomplete, with several years showing no evidence of proper nominating procedures or vote tallies. Worst of all, she found a memo from the previous HOA president dated 7 years ago outlining concerns about governance, procedures, and recommending a comprehensive review of the association's compliance with state law. The memo had been filed and forgotten, its recommendations never implemented. Karen had inherited a poorly managed organization and, in her focus on enforcing community standards, had never bothered to ensure that the HOA itself was operating legally. Now David Henderson was about to discover every procedural shortcut, every missing document, every governance failure that had accumulated over years of informal management. She called Marcus Chen, the HOA's legal advisor, with growing desperation. Marcus, I need to know exactly what happens if our records don't meet every technical requirement of state law. Karen, what kind of problems are we talking about? Missing meeting minutes, incomplete election records, financial approvals that may not have followed proper procedures. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. How extensive are these problems? Extensive enough that I'm concerned about our legal exposure. Karen, You need to understand that HOA governance law is taken very seriously by state regulators. If there are systematic compliance, the documents arrived at David Henderson's house on a Friday afternoon, delivered by a courier service in 3 banker's boxes that required his signature to accept. David carried them into his home office, noting the careful way they'd been: organized binders with color-coded tabs, manila folders arranged chronologically, and a cover letter from Karen Martinez explaining the comprehensive nature of the HOA's record-keeping system. But as David began his review that evening, it became clear that Karen's careful presentation was designed to hide rather than reveal. The records were incomplete in ways that suggested systematic negligence rather than simple oversight. 3 years of meeting minutes were missing entirely. Financial records showed large expenditures approved without proper board votes. Election documentation was so sparse that it was impossible to verify whether any legitimate elections had taken place since Karen assumed the presidency by Sunday night. David had filled a legal pad with notes documenting what appeared to be a pattern of governance failures that violated multiple state laws, but buried in the financial records. He found something that transformed his understanding of the situation completely. It was a buy invoice from March of the previous year. The invoice was from Clearview Document Management, a service that specialized in digitizing and organizing business records. The amount was substantial: $8,500 for comprehensive HOA record digitization and file organization services. David stared at the invoice, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Someone had paid a professional service to organize the HOA's records in March of last year, exactly when Karen would have been reviewing his architectural application during her chaotic travel schedule. He pulled up Clearview's website and found their contact information. Monday morning, he called their office and spoke with a project manager named Sandra Reeves. "I'm calling about work your company did for the Willowbrook Estates HOA last March," David said. "I'm a homeowner trying to understand the scope of the project." "Let me pull up that file," Sandra said. After a moment, she continued. "Yes, that was an interesting project. The client needed urgent digitization and organization of several years' worth of HOA records. We had a very tight timeline. Everything needed to be completed within 2 weeks. Do you remember who requested the work?" "The HOA president, Karen Martinez. She said they were conducting an internal audit and needed everything properly organized and digitized immediately." David felt his pulse quicken. "Did she mention why the audit was happening?" "She said there had been some compliance concerns raised by residents, and the board wanted to ensure all their documentation was in order. We worked around the clock to get everything organized, scanned, and filed properly." After hanging up, David sat quietly in his office, understanding finally dawning. Karen hadn't simply forgotten about his architectural approval. It had been conducting a systematic reorganization of HOA records precisely when his application would have been processed. She'd been so focused on covering up years of poor record-keeping that she'd lost track of routine business, including his project approval. But more importantly, the timing suggested that Karen had known about governance problems for months before David's records request. The expensive document management service hadn't been hired to maintain good records. It had been hired to create the appearance of good records after years of negligent management. David picked up his phone and called Michael Torres. "I need to ask you about something called consciousness of guilt," David said. "If someone tries to fix a problem after they know it's being investigated, does that constitute evidence of wrongdoing?" "Absolutely," Michael replied. "If we can show that she hired a document management service to clean up records after becoming aware of compliance issues, that demonstrates she knew the records were inadequate. It's actually stronger evidence than the missing records themselves." "How much stronger?" "Strong enough to suggest intentional misconduct rather than simple negligence. Strong enough to trigger criminal rather than civil penalties." That afternoon, David drove to Clearview's offices and met with Sandra Reeves in person. She was a professional woman in her 40s who took obvious pride in her company's reputation for discretion and quality work. "I need to understand exactly what condition the HOA records were in when you received them." "David," said Sandra, hesitated. "Mr. Henderson, we have confidentiality agreements with our clients. I can't discuss specific details about the work we performed." "I'm not asking you to violate any agreements," David said. I'm a homeowner in that association, and I have a legal right to understand how my HOA fees were spent. This was a substantial expenditure that affects all residents. After consulting with her supervisor, Sandra agreed to provide a general description of the project scope. What she described made David's blood run cold. The HOA records had been in complete disarray. Financial documents were scattered across multiple locations with no systematic filing. Meeting minutes were handwritten on scraps of paper, many illegible or incomplete. Election records were virtually non-existent, just informal notes about who had volunteered for various positions. In 15 years of doing this work, Sandra said, I've never seen an organization with records in such poor condition. It appeared that no one had maintained systematic documentation for years. What did Ms. Martinez tell you about how the records got that way? She said the previous administration had been disorganized, and she'd been working to improve things. Gradually, but she admitted that she'd focused more on community management than paperwork, and things had gotten away from her. David thanked Sandra and drove home, his mind racing with implications. Karen hadn't just made occasional mistakes, she'd been running an organization with no legitimate documentation for years. Every decision she'd made, every rule she'd enforced, every authority she'd claimed was built on a foundation of illegal governance. But the most damning element was the timing. Karen had known about these problems and had tried to fix them quietly, without informing the homeowners whose fees had paid for both her mismanagement and her attempted cover-up. That evening, David found Sarah in their completed pavilion, a glass of wine, while reviewing marketing proposals for her consulting business. The space was beautiful, exactly what they'd envisioned when they'd submitted their architectural plans over a year ago. How bad is it? Sarah asked, looking up from her laptop. David sat down beside her, setting down the legal pad filled with his notes. It's worse than I thought possible. Karen's been running an illegal organization for years, missing records, improper procedures, financial irregularities that could constitute fraud. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. What are you going to do? I'm going to file a complaint with the state regulatory agency, David said. What Karen's done isn't just harassment, it's systematic violation of laws designed to protect homeowners from exactly this kind of abuse. And what happens to her? David looked out at their neighborhood, thinking about the other residents who had trusted Karen to manage their community responsibly. The elderly couple next door who had lived here for 20 years, the young families who had bought homes believing they were investing in a well-managed community, the retirees who depended on stable property values for their financial security. If the state finds what I think they'll find, David said, Karen's going to face criminal charges, personal financial liability, and the complete destruction of everything she's built here. Sarah took his hand. Do you feel guilty about that, David? Considered the question carefully. 3 weeks ago, he would have felt terrible about ruining someone's life over a neighborhood dispute. But Karen had made this choice when she decided to use her authority to harass his family rather than admit a simple mistake. No, he said finally. I feel sorry for her, but I don't feel guilty. She created this situation through years of illegal behavior. I'm just the person who finally called her on it. The next morning, David submitted a comprehensive complaint to the state's Department of Commerce and Insurance, which regulated homeowners associations. The complaint documented the missing records, the improper governance procedures, the financial irregularities, and the attempted cover-up through the document. Management service. He also included a timeline showing how Karen's harassment of his family had begun immediately after her records request, would have revealed the scope of her compliance failures. The complaint was 37 pages long, with supporting documentation that filled 2 binders. It was the kind of systematic, thoroughly researched document that David's career had trained him to create: methodical, comprehensive, and devastating. 3 days later, David received a call from investigator Robert Chen with the state regulatory agency. Mr. Henderson, we've reviewed your complaint, and we'll be opening a formal investigation into the Willowbrook Estates HOA, based on the documentation you've provided. This appears to be a serious case of governance violations. What does that mean for the investigation timeline? We'll be conducting on-site interviews and document review within the next 2 weeks. Depending on what we find, this could result in criminal referrals, civil penalties, and mandatory reorganization of the association. After hanging,